All right, welcome everybody back to the College 12 Pack. I'm your host, Patrick Kahn, senior editor of the College Wires. With me, as always, as you can see right there on your screen, Tyler Natuno, LSU Tigers Wire for the win, and my co-host each and every week. Last week, it was the College 25 Pack, right, Tyler? I mean, I think that's what we were calling it, just because we went over our top 25. Today, we're back to 12. We're talking college football playoff, way too early predictions. Now, with the caveat, we're probably going to be wrong, right? We understand that. But this is how we see it right now, today, as we're recording this Wednesday afternoon. Tyler, I'm going to let you kick things off as we get into number 12. And we all know the spot. We think we have a pretty good idea. This is likely going to be a group of 5 team. I don't see them passing into the at-large teams. But when it came to our composite 12-team predictions, who do we have at number 12?
Yeah, so just to, again, kind of clarify on that point, the group of 5 team is not guaranteed to have the number 12 seed in the new playoff format. That's just probably what's going to end up happening more often than not. And that's what we project here. So we've got Liberty. We've got Liberty running it back. They made the New Year's Six last year, and we have them being the first team to make the CFP field with the automatic guaranteed bid for the G5, highest G5 champion. So, I mean, I think we both kind of agreed when looking at this that there's not really a lot of clear contenders in the G5. A lot of teams, teams like Tulane losing Michael Pratt and more than that too, like teams poised to take a step back, teams like SMU now joining the Power Four. So they're no longer eligible for that spot. So I think looking at what we've got here, I think that Liberty is probably the safest bet. I mean, don't really lose a ton. I mean, when you look at what they bring back the most important piece, which is arguably the best quarterback in the entire G5 and maybe the entire country in Caden Salter. A guy who had 44 total touchdowns last year, threw only 6 picks, was a 1,000-yard rusher for them. A really productive player. And he's going to need a big year because he did lose his top receiver. CJ Daniels, a guy who led them in receiving by a wide stretch, was a 1,000-yard guy last year. Transferred to LSU this offseason, so they don't have him coming back. But I still think when you look at the returning production here, like especially on the ground, with Salter, what Salter can do with his legs, plus, they got a guy in Quentin Cooley who's one of the best G5 running backs in the country coming off a 1,400-yard season. So I really like what you're looking at here on offense, at least. When you look at the defense, they bring back less, but it's still a group full of veteran guys, maybe not the most experienced guys, but guys who, are not young players, being thrown into action. So I think when you look at this roster, it's probably the most complete team in the G5 as far as, the information that we have right now.
Looking at them, I really wanted to go with a team that's returning even more production. When you look at Memphis, they weren't the number 1 team returning the most production among G5. I think Rice was number 1 because they came in at number 5. But when I look at Memphis and what they were able to do, they're a team that I thought potentially could be up there. But I kind of agree. I'm going to go with which team has the best quarterback, because ultimately I think when you look at tiebreakers, that's where it starts. So for me, I'm going to go with you with Caden Salter. Yes, they lose their top wide receiver, CJ Daniels, as you talked about. But I just feel like he gives them the best chance to win that Conference USA and really get the G5 representation in the 12. So that's where we start off, kick things off as we look at our projected 12. And now they'll take on the number 5 seed on campus based on these projections, and we'll get into that number 5 seed a little bit later. I'm going to go number 11 here. Now, some people might have them higher. I don't think agreed on it, but Missouri Tigers, coming in at number 11, and they're a team that really surprised a lot of people. I think the job that Drink did last year with this team, while they get into the Cotton Bowl and they beat an Ohio State team that I don't think the motivation was there, and obviously the Ohio State Buckeyes are going to look a little bit different this year. But I still like the fact that they bring Brady Cook back to quarterback. You got Luther Burden coming in. Not only that, Bill Connolly did this returning production list. They check in at number 18, so they're top 20 in what they're bringing back. Not only that, they went into technically the SEC and brought in 3 contributors that are really going to help this team We talk about Caden Green, who's transferring in from Oklahoma, offensive tackle, a guy who can really be a bookend blocker for this offensive line. We talk about Darius Smith, the edge rusher from Georgia, and then obviously the former Gators defensive lineman Chris McClellan. I think you can kind of plug him in the middle. That's going to really help that team. But I still think Missouri is going to be a very tough out each and every week this year. But I think they're definitely going to be one of the initial 12 when it's all said and done. I know the SEC is really competitive this year. You've just added 2 more teams to make it even more so. But I still believe in what Coach Drink is doing in this Missouri team.
Yeah, I mean, imagine someone telling you back when we found out that this was moving to 12 that pretty much across the board everyone would have Missouri in their 12-team playoff predictions. I'm not sure we would have believed that, but I mean, it makes a lot of sense, at this point when you look at what they're bringing back. I mean, on offense, you kind of hit on it. They bring back, the most important pieces in terms of, very solid quarterback in Brady Cook, Luther Burden, who's maybe the best receiver in the entire country, like you mentioned. And not only that, I'm pretty sure they also bring back their 3 leading receivers from last year. Not just Burden, but they bring back a lot of production at that position. Not entirely running things back. I mean, some pretty significant losses. On offense, you lose running back Cody Schrader. On defense, losing players like Tyron Hopper. Quite a bit of lost production on defense, actually. I mean, I think you got to like the way they portaled this offseason. Chris McClellan, a guy that I've watched a good amount of at Florida, definitely a guy that showed a lot of potential in his first couple seasons. So I think, you got to like that pickup for them, landed a 5-star defensive lineman in Williams Nwaneri. So I think, they're in a pretty good spot despite the losses. I think this is a team that, is pretty poised to be a top 5, certainly an upper half, but probably more like top 5 team in the SEC.
Absolutely. And we're going to stay in the SEC, right, Tyler, as we dive into number 10 now. I think the recurring theme is you're going to hear SEC flavor on this, right? I think we can all agree that the SEC is going to be well represented. Big Ten, we're going to talk about in a little bit. But let's go with number 10 here.
Yes, I mean the expansion in the format of the expansion was made to cater to the SEC and Big Ten, so it's not surprising that we're going to project a lot of SEC and Big Ten teams in this field. So at number 10, we have Alabama. Still have them getting back to the CFP in the first year under Kalen DeBoer. I think we both have pretty significant questions about this roster. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I'll be honest, when we talked about this team earlier this offseason during spring ball, I was talking pretty bullish on the defense. After looking into this roster, man, I think I may have gotten a little ahead of my skis there. They lose a ton on the defensive side of the ball. According to the Bill Connolly returning production rankings that you mentioned, they return just 33% of their defensive returning production, or return just 33% of their defensive production. That ranks 126th nationally out of 134 teams. And they rank 116th or 115th overall in returning production. So a lot of losses on both sides of the ball. But when you look at the defense, I mean, they had the losses to the draft, guys like Dallas Turner, guys like Kool-Aid McKinstry, Terry and Arnold, all those guys are gone. Had some losses in the portal too, most significantly, Caleb Downs, maybe the best player on this entire defense last year, maybe one of the best defensive players in the entire country, going to Ohio State. So they've had pretty significant losses there. I think if you're going to see this team, be competitive for a national title this year, I think it's going to be because the offense takes a step forward. And I think there's reason to think they could. I mean, I think Jalen Milroe, especially the way he was playing at the end of the year, I think you could talk yourself into him having a pretty nice season, especially in a Kalen DeBoer offense that, is well tailored to quarterbacks. He's had a lot of success with quarterbacks before. And you look at Milroe, a talented guy who can run and throw, you got to think there's going to be a lot of uses for that. I'm more questioned about what's going on around him. When you consider the top 3 leading receivers from this team in last year in Jermaine Burton, Isaiah Bond, and Amari Niblack, the tight end, are all gone. Burton's in the NFL, and then Bond and Niblack both transferred to Texas. So when you look at this receiving core, it's like, okay, maybe Kobe Prentice is a guy that could step up this year. They got Jeremy Bernard, a transfer from Washington who followed DeBoer. So there's some potential with this group. I'm not saying it's going to be bad, but I think, the skill positions is a real question. They also lost their top 2 leading rushers, Jason McClellan to the draft and then Roydell Williams to the portal. So just a lot of new faces here, not untalented team, just, unclear how this is all going to look with the new system too.
Yeah, and then you talk about the defense, right? And you look at who they lost and where they lost. One interesting name though that kind of like got my attention, Damani Jackson. This is a guy coming out of recruiting, was a highly touted guy, a guy that was really wanted. So I'm kind of curious of how he steps into kind of Terry and Arnold, Kool-Aid McKinstry role and how he plays. And just to make me feel old, Dre Kirkpatrick Jr. That made me feel a little bit old, realizing that his son is now playing college ball. But yeah, I think you're right. There are questions, right? We have questions about Alabama, but also based on what we've seen from their new head coach Kalen DeBoer, what he's done along the way in his various stops, we know the offense is going to be a strong point for them. And I think he's always done more with less in terms of the quality of players. So what does he do now when he's getting those Alabama quality players? And I think Jeremy Bernard, like you talked about, he's going to be a guy that's going to do well. I want to see if Kendrick Law and Kobe Prentice kind of step up this year. But having Jalen Milroe back is going to be a huge factor for them. And they have, in all intents and purposes, the quarterback of the future on the roster. You talk about Austin Mack, because I know a lot of guys in Seattle definitely didn't want to lose that guy. So, he might be a guy that we're going to get to see down the stretch. But I mean, I think when you look at Alabama, I think this is a good spot for them. I think that they're a team that could potentially win 10 games. I think anything less than that, they might be seen as oh no, what happened? But anytime you're replacing a legend, it's going to be increasingly difficult. But we know what the expectation level is, and if it's unreasonable or not, that's what we come to expect with Alabama and the SEC. All right, number 9 is one that I put on my list. Tyler did not have them on his list whatsoever. Clemson Tigers. Okay. We know that they have consistently been one of the better teams in college football. The last 2 years have not been up to the standard of what we expect of Clemson football. Why is that? Well, I think because the game has changed. You've got to prioritize transfer portal. And once again, Dabo Swinney brought absolutely no one in while losing his top running back to the NFL, his top wide receiver to Notre Dame. And really, so it's up to Cade Klubnik. It's up to Phil Maffa to carry that offense. And, oh, by the way, they lost their best safety in Andrew Makuba, who is now transferred to Texas. My big question for this team, but I still think they're talented, and I'm not sold on the ACC as a whole. As I look at the ACC, I still think that Clemson is likely the class because I think there's going to be a step back with Florida State. But are they going to have to rely on a freshman wide receiver, Bryant Wesco, who showed a little something in their spring game, but he is a true freshman. And you don't want to rely too much on him. They've got a lot of questions, but I still think because of how weak the ACC is, they can be that team that really steps in.
Yeah, I mean, I think you and I disagree a little bit about FSU's step back relative to Clemson's step forward, but I can totally see your point. I mean, I think that with the ACC being so wide open and having no clear contenders at the top, it wouldn't take a lot for Clemson to not only sneak into this field but win this conference and secure a top 4 seed. So I understand that. I guess my thing with this team is like, I don't really see what's going to be different this year unless Cade Klubnik just takes a massive step forward, which is possible. I mean, he's a talented player, and I think we've seen moments with him where it's like, okay, like I can see where this could go. Like you can see the vision, you can see the potential. He's just very inconsistent, and I don't think the offense he's in has really done him a ton of favors. I'm not sure the move to Garrett Riley calling plays last year had quite the intended effect that we thought it would. And I don't think they've really put enough around him talent-wise. I mean, we talked about it last week, losing Bo Collins, one of their best receivers, to Notre Dame. They still bring Tyler Brown back, who's a very good receiver. And if you had to lose one of those two, you probably pick Bo Collins. But, I mean, it's not like they have the depth to really make up for a loss like that. And when you don't take anyone in the transfer portal, which they didn't take a single player, not even a backup. So, I mean, you really start looking at this team. And by the way, when I talked about the defense last week, I also think maybe a little bit more putting faith in what they've done in the past versus looking at the roster, because they lost a lot on defense. So I could see how it works out. Like, the defense, is able to keep it going the way they have the last few years there. And then maybe the offense takes some sort of leap with Cade Klubnik in his second full season as the starter. But if those things don't happen, even in the ACC, I have a hard time seeing this team being a playoff caliber team.
I will revisit my stance on Clemson after week 1. I think we're going to learn a lot.
Well, I don't know, though, because, I think they're probably going to get killed in that game. But I don't know if that means they couldn't win the ACC. Like, they maybe could still win the ACC.
Well, I guess my point, I'm not as worried about the defensive side of the ball. I think that's probably been the most consistent thing in Clemson.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to point to one part of the team, I feel like the defense has always been consistent. It's can the offense keep up? And like you said, they're probably going to get killed week 1. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But I want to see that leap with Cade Klubnik that we talked about. So for me, right now, I'm going to say Clemson. But again, we'll kind of see how it looks, and hopefully, if it doesn't go the way that Clemson fans want, maybe Dabo will revisit his whole idea of taking 0 transfers on whatsoever.
I wouldn't hold my breath on that one.
I'm not either. But let's keep it moving. We're going to go back to the SEC for number 8 here.
Yeah, we're going back to the SEC once again, and we're sticking with the team from the former SEC West. It's the Ole Miss Rebels. So I think a huge year for Lane Kiffin. I think when you look at what they did this offseason, it's a transfer-heavy roster. They portaled a ton. But it was all, they were all blockbuster portal moves for the most part. Some huge additions. And I think when you look at an offense that was already very good, Jackson Dart took, a big step last year as a playmaker. I think, a really good unit. Did lose Quinshon Judkins. That hurts. But they bring still Trey Harris back, Ulysses Bentley back, 2 of the better skill position players in the SEC. And then they added, Juice Wells, a number of offensive line transfers. So I think the offense just kind of retooled a group that was already pretty good. On the defensive side, it's more of a complete new look. A lot of new guys that are going to be starting here. Walter Nolan, a former 5-star defensive tackle from Texas A&M, hasn't quite become a dominant player through 2 seasons in his career, but has shown a lot of flashes. A very solid player. Big addition for them. And I think you look at guys like, Princely Uman-Mielen, at Florida was one of the better edge rushers in the SEC. Trey Amos, a guy who comes from Alabama, was originally at Louisiana. Again, guy that didn't start last year for Alabama, but has played a lot. They've just got a lot of guys coming in. Chris Paul, a linebacker from Arkansas. Like, these are there's a lot of new faces all over this team. And I don't know if this roster is as good as, the best teams in the country. Like, I don't know if this roster is as good as a Georgia or a Texas or an Oregon or whatever, but I think this is about as close as you're going to get at Ole Miss. And it's certainly as close as Ole Miss has been in a very long time. So I think this is kind of the year. If you're going to win a couple big games, the schedule's not that bad, relatively speaking. I think this is the year to go do it.
Yeah, and I'm with you on Dart and the changes that he made, because if you looked at him at the end of the season prior, the dude was a turnover machine, like fumbles, interceptions, cost them a bowl game against Texas Tech in the Texas Bowl where he turned it over 4 times. And then you look at what, he looked like. I had questions whether he was going to be the starting quarterback with Spencer Sanders there and Walker Howard, the former LSU signee there. I wondered if that pressure was going to get to Dart and he ultimately fumble or crumble, I should say. And it didn't happen. We saw a much better team. And Ole Miss had the best season that they've ever had when you look at the number of wins that Lane Kiffin provided when you're talking about what they were able to do. So now the question is, what do you do to build upon that? And once again, he proved why we call him the transfer king. He brought in a lot of talent. So he's got the talent. Now he's got to show us. He's got to win the big game. He's got to be able to, beat the Alabamas, the Georgias of the world, if he wants to win an SEC. But even if he doesn't, if he goes 10-2, 11-1, doesn't win the division, there is no more division, doesn't win the SEC, I still think that there's a path for them in the playoff, and this is perfect for Ole Miss. And I want to see them do better, and I want to put him higher on the pedestal as far as the SEC, because there is a vacuum. There's a power vacancy, so to speak, in the SEC. Who's going to fill it? We know Kirby Smart's going to be there. Who's next? And there's an opportunity for Ole Miss. I just don't know if I'm quite ready to put him up there, but he's got the opportunity. Now he's got to prove it. Another team that's kind of given this opportunity is our number 7 team here, and we're talking about the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. They have an opportunity here to get back in the playoff. They're one of the few teams that, despite not playing, in a strong conference, they don't play in conference at all. That was consistently getting into the college football playoff during the 4-team era. They never won because they were outclassed. Going up against the SEC will do that to you. That being said, I think that their head coach did a fantastic job with addressing needs. And we've talked about him already, Bo Collins. That was a major addition. When you talk about guys that they can throw the football to. The biggest question is going to be Riley Leonard. Can he stay healthy? He's already had to have surgery on that ankle, that same ankle that bothered him all last year. We kind of waited for Riley to take that leap based on what we saw the year prior. We never really got to see it because he couldn't stay healthy. So that's the big question. Can he stay healthy? But let me give you an under-the-radar guy that I want to pay attention to this year. Wide receiver Chris Mitchell, who's coming over from Florida International. He's a guy that I think in this offense will do well as long as his quarterback stays healthy.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to me, this is a really fascinating program right now. I think it's maybe not getting the offseason attention it deserves. I think probably just because, first of all, it's not at the center of any of this realignment madness. We're talking about, the new look Big Ten, the new look SEC. None of that pertains to Notre Dame. Their path is functionally still the same. They needed to, they probably had to go 11-1 or 12-0 pretty much every year to have a shot to make the playoffs. That hasn't really changed. They're just looking for an at-large bid. But I'm really curious to see what they can do this year, because I think Marcus Freeman, it's hard to evaluate because I think they've lost some games they really should have won under Freeman to this point. But I also really like a lot of the things he's doing. I think the way they're acquiring talent is really promising, especially compared to the way, it's been done at Notre Dame in the past. Like, I think, he's found a way to maximize things a little bit better. I'm curious about this team because, I think I was excited about the Sam Hartman experiment last year, and it started out really strong. I think it sort of fizzled out a little bit, toward the end. And I wonder about Riley Leonard, not just because of his health. I think Riley Leonard is a more effective playmaker than Sam Hartman in a lot of ways. Can do a lot more with his legs. I don't know if he's as polished of a passer, though. And I'm curious how this Notre Dame offense, looks this year. The schedule really isn't too bad for them. They open with Texas A&M, interesting game, in Mike Elko's first outing. I believe that game's in College Station. And they also play Florida State and USC are kind of the other two marquee games, and both teams that we expect to take a step back this year. So, I mean, I think there's a good chance this Notre Dame team is favored in almost every game, if not all of them. So,
almost poetic that Mike Elko's first game as head coach at Texas A&M, and he's going up against his former quarterback from Duke. That is great. But
also, he was a DC at Notre Dame too, wasn't he? Didn't he come? He came from Notre Dame originally. Yeah, Jimbo hired him from Notre Dame.
Yep. So we'll see how it all plays out. But yeah, I think I agree with you. It's also a team that doesn't return a ton of production. They don't have like a ton of transfers that are projected to be starters. But it's a lot of guys who just haven't had that production, haven't had that play time because of whoever was in front of them. So it's going to be really interesting to kind of see how that plays out. But yeah, I agree. I think Riley brings a level of playmaking ability. Again, it's that caveat that we keep saying every time we discuss Notre Dame. Can he stay healthy? Because I think if you have to rely on one of these two backup quarterbacks to play significant time at Notre Dame this year, it's not going to go well. Is really my big takeaway from looking at Notre Dame at number 7. All right, so let's journey into the Big Ten. We've talked about it. Who do we have coming in at number 6?
Yeah, journeying to the Big Ten, but we're actually heading out west with one of the newcomers. We got the Oregon Ducks coming in at number 6. So, a team that also had a big offseason in terms of, headliner guys in the transfer portal. A little bit different from some of the other teams like Ole Miss that did that because they really honestly didn't need to that badly. I mean, they actually return a decent amount on both sides of the ball despite losing a top 15 pick in the draft at quarterback in Bo Nix. I feel like the Dylan Gabriel pickup is pretty solid continuity there. I mean, I think you're swapping out one, very old, very experienced quarterback who's played a ton of college football games at a high level for another one that has done the same thing. And I think maybe even Gabriel gives you a little bit more of an added element, both as a passer and, with his mobility. So I'm intrigued by that pickup. I think that is interesting, and they also lost, their leading rusher, Bucky Irving, their leading receiver, Troy Franklin, but especially looking at the receiving core, they bring back a guy in Tez Johnson who had almost 1,200 yards last year, and they add Evan Stewart, who was one of the best receivers in the SEC over the last 2 years at Texas A&M. So, I mean, hard to really feel like they took much of a drop-off at all on offense. Like, even with the losses, you could convince me that this group is even more productive this year. And then looking at their defense, they rank top 30 in returning production this season. So, and they still were able to portal at a few positions of need, plugging some holes here and there. I think the most notable one I would say is cornerback Jabbar Muhammad, who's coming in from Washington, was a very hot, highly desired guy in the portal, ultimately, leaves Washington to go join their rival at Oregon. So, I mean, when you look at what this team is doing, what Dan Lanning's been able to do, I mean, truthfully, when I look at the Big Ten, I only see 2 teams that are operating in a way that sets them up to be perennial national title contenders, and those teams are Ohio State and Oregon.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, honestly, because I know I'm very familiar with the Big 12, I think adding Kobe Savage at free safety or one of your safeties out of Kansas State was a under-the-radar type pickup. You talk about that defense, on the back end, you get some help there. Of course, Jabbar Muhammad, which we've talked about. And then, I think Dylan Gabriel, it's kind of plug and play when it came to the quarterback situation. And they also added Dante Moore, who was originally committed to them in the previous recruiting cycle, opted to go to UCLA. Now he's back. So you kind of have your quarterback of the future beyond Dylan Gabriel kind of lined up and ready to go. But Evan Stewart, I think, you worry about losing the production of Troy Franklin, but adding Evan Stewart, I don't think this offense could have gone, or this offseason could have got any better for Dan Lanning and what the Ducks are doing, despite the fact that they're jumping up and going into that Big Ten, which, again, if you look at the teams right now, there's no reason to say that Oregon isn't among the 2 best teams in the conference.
I think they pretty clearly – yeah, so I think
clearly them and Ohio State.
Yeah.
And we'll get into Ohio State here in a minute. But let's talk about the 5th team. Now, this is the team that in our projections would be facing Liberty in Austin. Great setup for them. Texas Longhorns at number 5. We have differing opinions on Quinn Ewers. I'm a little more bullish on him than you are. But that's neither here nor there. We'll get into that at a later time. But you talk about Quinn Ewers returning, despite the fact that everybody wants to talk about Arch Manning. Quinn Ewers, it's his team. He's the quarterback. Now, he lost Xavier Worthy, A.D. Mitchell, Jatavion Sanders, one of the best receiving tight ends in the country. He also lost Jonathan Brooks to an ACL tear. And a myriad of other players on the offensive side of the ball. But what you have to like is that they went out and portaled very well. They got a 5-star guy in Isaiah Bond, which is interesting that he chose to go to Texas. They added Silas Bolden from Oregon State, who's a very accomplished wide receiver. And then Matthew Golden, who they go and pluck from nearby Houston. So they've kind of filled those voids. You talked about Niblack as the tight end kind of coming in, and along with Gunnar Helm, who's been there for a while. And then obviously C.J. Baxter's returning at running back. And then I look over on the defensive side of the ball, and I see Trey Moore, the edge out of UTSA, and then obviously Andrew Makuba, the safety from Clemson. You really have to like what Sark has done in this offseason leading up to their debut in the SEC. Not only that, they're coming off a Big 12 championship. They're coming off their first ever appearance in the college football playoff. Texas is really setting up for a chance to not only challenge for the SEC championship in year one, and they're going to get their chances to prove it because they are hosting Georgia this year in Austin. I believe it's the week or the game after the Red River rivalry against Oklahoma. Texas is going to have their opportunities to really prove that they belong, and that's why we have them here at number 5.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll see. You know, we'll learn how this Texas team is able to manage the week in, week out, you know, difficulty that playing in the SEC brings. It's going to be something a little bit new. But with that being said, I mean, I think that Sark has done all the things in terms of off the field and preparation that they need to do to hit the ground running in the SEC and be very successful right off the bat. I mean, I think you look at this year's roster and like Quinn Ewers, I'm not like a Quinn Ewers hater, to be clear. Like I think I've seen a lot of moments from Quinn Ewers that I think are really good and moments where I think that, you know, he could be a very good quarterback. I've seen enough where I question that to make me a little nervous, just given what they're also losing, you know, the talent, the skill positions, you know, the receivers and Jonathan Brooks. Like he's going to have to shoulder, I think, a bigger load this year than he did last year. And that's, you know, we'll see how that works out for them. You know, I think, you know, like you said, did a good job of plugging holes because they lost a lot of talent really across the board, you know, on defense too. But I mean, I think that I really like this Texas team, honestly. I think you could easily talk me into Texas winning the SEC. I didn't have them winning the SEC in my projections either. This is where I believe I have them at 5 also. But yeah, I mean, I think this is a team I could easily see coming and winning the SEC in year one. I just think it takes a little bit less projecting to say that, or to say the team that we ultimately have winning the SEC.
Yeah, no, I don't think that there's any disagreement where we kind of have Texas. I kind of feel like they're that next tier in the SEC behind Georgia, who, you know, year in and year out really have proven, even when Alabama was, you know, dominating, it's proven that they belonged in that upper echelon. So the big question is who joins them in the upper echelon. And I think Texas has just as good a shot as anybody. When you look at that roster they built, the talent they already had, they have one of the best offensive tackles in the country, guarding the blind side of Quinn Ewers when you talk about Kelvin Banks. But yeah, I mean, it's a virtually a new wide receiver core that they're, you know, and it takes time to build that, you know, that chemistry. You know, they do have some guys that have been there, but ultimately, you know, there's a lot of new faces. We talk about transfers, freshman Ryan Wingo, 5-star wide receiver. They have some other guys that, you know, they're going to have to kind of work in. But for me on it, I think the big key that they're going to have, and this is something they haven't had since Joseph Asai was there, is that dominant off the edge guy who can kind of take over games. You know, maybe not to the level of a Will Anderson out of Alabama, but I think Trey Moore is going to have to kind of be that guy for them. They need a guy who can consistently win against the offensive line and get in the backfield and create disruption. Because ultimately, as we know in the SEC, you've got to have defensive guys who show up in big moments. But I still think, like we've talked about, this Texas team is built just for that. Now we're going to get into our top 4. Now, these are our top 4 conference champions, the Power 4 guys, which the top 4 ranked conference title champions, which the only 4 left, will gain that bye week, and then they will jump into the mix. But at number 4, coming out of the ACC, we differ on this one, but you know, composite is composite. Tyler, take it away with the ACC champ.
Yeah, so this is ultimately, the composite is ultimately what I had in mind, which is Florida State. I think they actually pull it off this year and find a way to get into the playoffs. I mean, truthfully, like you said, you know, guaranteed top 4 seeds go to the highest ranked Power 4 champions. Because of that, you know, I mean, truthfully, I'm not sure this is an FSU team that would even be in the top 10 of the CFP rankings at the end of the season. I could easily see them not, but I could also easily see them winning the ACC. I mean, I think they're poised to take a pretty significant step back this year. I don't really see any reality where that doesn't happen, because for a few reasons. I mean, largely, I truthfully, I think DJU is a capable starter. I think they could have certainly done worse. I still think he has his limitations, and I can't escape the feeling that this is a downgrade from Jordan Travis. I mean, Jordan Travis, not a guy that was like a first-round NFL draft pick kind of talent, but a guy that, ran the offense really well, managed the ball. Those are things kind of DJ struggled with. So I'm a little curious how that looks this year, especially on a team that loses, Keon Coleman at receiver, Trey Benson at running back. They replaced those guys in the portal. They actually replaced them both with Alabama transfers in Malik Benson at receiver and Roydell Williams at running back. I don't think you're really getting the same thing. I mean, Malik Benson is a guy who, has talent but has not played a ton. So it's not the same situation as when you went and got Keon Coleman from Michigan State last year, who was already one of the proven best receivers in the country. So I think there's a lot of questions there. And, while the defense brings back more production than the offense does, they still lose a lot of guys that we, remember from last year's team. Braden Fisk, Jared Verse, Tatum Bethune, their leading tackler, Akeem Dent, they're one of their really good DBs. All those guys, they're all in the NFL now. So, how that group looks this year without those, I think without those guys is going to be a big question. I just have fewer questions about them than I do about, say, Clemson or Miami or Louisville or North Carolina or like any team like that could potentially compete to come out of the ACC. So I'll stick with Florida State for now. I just ultimately, I think it'd be very ironic if this Florida State team ultimately makes the playoffs and last year's team didn't, because I think this team is going to be a lot worse than last year's team was.
Yeah, I mean, in different circumstances, obviously, because even if Florida State doesn't win the ACC, they ideally could still find a way into the college playoff as an at-large bid. But I guess my biggest concern is looking at the quarterback situation, and then who they lost and who they replaced them with. When you brought up bringing a Malik Benson in place of Keon Coleman, who, like we've talked about, arguably one of the best wide receivers in the country, Roydell Williams. Coming in to play running back. But when it comes to DJ, when I look at him, can he go win me a football game? Like, just on you alone. Will this team to a victory? I have my questions, but I also don't hate your pick that they're going to win the ACC, because I feel like it's likely going to come down to Florida State or Clemson, but I'm also kind of keeping my eye over there on Louisville, because we saw what they were last year in a job that Braum has done. I question it with their quarterback situation not because I don't like Tyler Shough. I've seen this story. He doesn't stay healthy. And that's going to be a big thing, because if he's not healthy, I look at the roster behind him and I'm not really sold. And kind of the same thing with DJU here at Florida State. When you look at the quarterbacks behind him, when you talk about Brock Glenn, I don't really see a guy who's that next step. Maybe it's one of their younger guys that they brought in, potentially. But I have my questions, but I also don't hate your selection here. Which, like I said, I wasn't as high on him, but I still was high enough that they were in my list of teams among the top 12. And going to number 3, we're going to the Big 12, which is last year, maybe if we were in a 12-team playoff, we would have saw multiple Big 12 teams. But going into this year, it's going to be a little different. It's Utah Utes for me. I think that they're the clear front runner, so to speak. This takes nothing away from a Oklahoma State team that virtually brings back almost their entire team from a year ago. They have the reigning Doak Walker Award winner in Ollie Gordon, who I absolutely love to watch play. But also that quarterback, he also went to Tech, and I know what happens with him. I've seen this story. I'm not sold on him. He has had injury history. He did stay relatively healthy last year, but still. When I look at Oklahoma State, I don't know that they can play consistently with a team like Utah, who is coached by probably the most underrated head coach when it comes to the top rankings in Kyle Whittingham, a guy who's consistently top 3 for me. I think he's one of the 3 best head coaches when you talk about the talent level he has and what he gets out of them. Now, looking at this team, Tyler, we've talked at length off air about this. I mean, getting Cam Rising back was massive. Him coming back, we'll see how he plays. I feel like there's going to be some rust he's got to knock off. He didn't play for a year. But then I look at, adding Tayshawn Lyons from Washington, wide receiver. That's an interesting pickup. Also adding Carson Ryan, the UCLA tight end. I think looking at this team and looking at what we have in the Big 12, I think you're going to see the usual suspects up at the top, whether you talk about Kansas State, because I believe in Chris Kleiman and what he does year in and year out, despite the fact he lost Will Howard. When you look at Oklahoma State, they're going to be up there. I'm interested to see what Deion Sanders does in year 2, but year 1 of the Big 12. But right now, if I'm pushing my pile to the center of the table and going all in, I don't know how I could go any other way than Kyle Whittingham and the Utah Utes.
Yep, fully agree. And Patrick and I are in lockstep agreement with our rankings from here on out. So I think, could you talk me into a team like Oklahoma State or even a team like Kansas State? Like, absolutely you could. But again, like you said, if you're asking me to put a bet down on it, I like Utah's chances as a newcomer in the league this year. I think, for a lot of the reasons you said, I think, a team that was still pretty good last year. I think the main reason they didn't, I joked that we wouldn't tolerate Bryson Barnes slander on the podcast last week, but let's be real. Like, I think the main reason they weren't competitive in the Pac-12 last year was because, or at least as competitive as they've been, is because the offense was, a limiting factor. It just was not the same without Cam Rising. So I think you got to question, what Cam Rising looks like. Took a year off. And not only that, but he had a gruesome knee injury. When he finally broke his silence about that last year, and kind of went in depth on what he's been going through, the details were not for the faint of heart. So, you always wonder how he's going to come back from that. But with him coming back with Brant Keithy, their really good tight end coming back he also missed all of last season with a torn ACL. And they return an insane amount of production on defense, by the way. They return, they're top 30 in returning production on both sides of the ball, but they're 16th overall in returning production. So, like, a lot of pieces that they get back. Losing Jaquindon Jackson on offense, but, like, that's really it. They lost their leading receiver also, but they bring back Money Parks. They bring in Dorian Singer, a talented player. I expect the defense is going to be good like it always is under Kyle Whittingham. Like, I think if this Utah team is able to get back to the level offensively that it was before Cam Rising got hurt, I think they are I don't want to say a shoe-in because anything can happen, but I think they are a prohibitive favorite to win this conference.
And good luck running inside against those big Samoans. That's what I'm going to say. They typically have a very stout defense. I think projected starters-wise, I think they only had to replace one, and they have Keenan Johnson transferred in to kind of play that one of those cornerback spots. But overall, you've got a unit who's played together, who have been in that Whittingham system, who came up as a defensive coach. So you expect that side of the ball is going to be covered. But I think you bring up a good point. But you also have to remember, this is a team that has, you add Dorian Singer, who was not near what he was at Arizona last year with USC. And maybe he just got lost in the shuffle. But USC had enough of their own issues. But I think, it could be a step up with him. And obviously they have their tight end set. They have 3 tight ends who can really, it's starting to look like an Iowa roster when you look at their tight ends and what they can do. I had what did I say?
No, I'm saying they're good Iowa. That's what you.
Good Iowa. Yeah. I thought I messed up there. No. I had some inner conversations when it came to this Big 12 team. I wanted to go Arizona just because I like what Noah Fafita does. But then Jed Fish went and took the job in Washington, and that pretty much sealed the deal because it was between those two teams. As I was thinking about this, even well before we decided we were going to discuss this today, that those would be among my top 2 teams. But it's ultimately Utah, which brings us to our number 2 team. I think this is a team that a lot of people are probably sick and tired of hearing about at this point. In recent years, who you got for us at number 2?
Yeah, well, people are sick and tired of hearing about him, but they didn't pull off the three-peat, so at least people don't have to deal with hearing about that. Yeah. So now we've got the Georgia Bulldogs at number 2. I don't think that's really much of a surprise to anyone. A team that, I mean, truthfully, like, they lose a lot every single year. I mean, they have a ton of guys that get drafted every single season. Don't really have a lot of attrition to the transfer portal. That's pretty typical for them. But I mean, with what they bring back, the talent they bring in every year, this should be a really good team again. I mean, truthfully, this maybe, I think, could be the best offense Kirby's had yet at Georgia. I think returning a quarterback in Carson Beck, who, had some really nice moments. I think overall just elevated the offense. I think he's capable of doing a little bit more. I think you're already seeing him get top 5, top 10, first overall, even draft pick hype. I think that's probably only going to continue throughout this season. And while they lose guys like Ladd McConkey and they lose Brock Bowers, like, I still like what they've got at the skill positions. Bring back Ra Thomas and Dominic Lovett, 2 guys they added inter-SEC transfers in the portal last year. They're still there and were pretty productive last year, so I think you got to like those moves. Oscar Delp, too, a tight end that has had some pretty solid production while playing behind Brock Bowers, so he maybe is poised for a breakout. You look at the addition of Trevor Etienne, a nice playmaking running back who's coming in from rival Florida. Like, they've got the pieces, I think, to be really good on offense this year. On the defensive side of the ball, there's way more turnover. There's just no sugarcoating it. They lose a lot. They still got some guys that we're familiar with. Nazir Stackhouse on the defensive line, Malik Starks in the defensive backfield. But while those guys are there, there's a lot of new faces, and I think maybe there is a step back in place, but it's hard to imagine they take like a considerable step back on defense just with the talent they have every year and the way they recruit. I mean, maybe it's not quite as good as we've seen, but I think it'll be plenty good enough to compete with the best teams in the SEC and the rest of the country. So like I said earlier, I mean, I think you could easily talk me into Texas winning the SEC, but I think you'd be pretty crazy right now to not pick Georgia as the safe bet.
Yeah, one guy you didn't even mention on the defensive side of the ball that I kind of have circles, number 13, Michael Williams. I think he's a guy who's going to be coming off the edge a little bit, really going to disrupt some backfields. But, yeah, I mean, if you were going to tell me that even though they lose a lot on defense, a Kirby Smart defense is not going to be one of the most aggressive defenses in the SEC while still not giving up a ton on the back end. Yeah, you talked about Malachi Starks, who's a really good ball hawk. Yeah, I don't, I had the internal debate, but ultimately I'm still 60-40 Georgia here over Texas. I think, they might be the 2 best teams in the SEC. But when I look at this team and what they've done year in and year out, I mean, we could play the old Shane Beamer quote about how many 5-stars they have on that team. But they plug in these guys and they don't miss a beat, You talked about the wide receiver core, and losing Ladd McConkey might hurt. But losing Brock Bowers, obviously that's going to be a huge drop off. Oscar Delp is not a slouch by any means. He was a highly coveted guy coming out of high school as well. You really have to like this Georgia team, which leaves us with the number 1 team on our rankings. And before we dive into how we differ on our rankings, we have number 1. Who is shocked that we're going to be talking about the Ohio State Buckeyes, who, if Oregon didn't have the best offseason, the number 1 offseason belonged to the Ohio State Buckeyes. Just when you look at what they added, I mean, they added arguably one of the best running backs in the country to an already loaded running back room. And Quinshon Judkins, one guy that I absolutely love to watch. They brought in Will Howard, which is another big addition because I think we both agree that he is an upgrade over what they had at quarterback. And it's nothing against the quarterback play that they had last year. I just think that Will Howard has been in those big moments. He took a Kansas State team and knocked off TCU when they were making their big run a couple of years ago. You just talk about what he was able to do, and he's dynamic in that he can throw the football. He can run the football. And let's not act like this is like a 2-star, 3-star guy who played at Kansas State, did well. This guy was 4-star recruit coming out of high school. He went to Kansas State to play for Kleiman, which just shows you the level of what Kleiman has been able to do. And now he's got a new head coach in Ryan Day. He's got a new offense coordinator in Chip Kelly. We can talk about this offense all day long. Do they lose a lot offensively? Yes, but they have Emeka Egbuka coming back, highly productive. They have a slew of 5-star wide receivers: Carnell Tate, Jeremiah Smith, Mylan Graham. I could go on and on. You add Will Howard, you add Quinshon Judkins. Oh yeah, by the way, they have Travion Henderson coming back too. Offensively loaded, and then a guy you talked about at end. On the back end of this defense, they add Caleb Downs, arguably one of the best safeties in the country, to that defense. That's already been productive. They got Jack Sawyer back, JT, the other right defensive end. We've seen him dominate games, absolutely take over games. So this team, looking at what they were able to do, is why I'm buying into Ohio State Buckeyes taking back their crown as the Big Ten champs and potentially winning, like they did when they introduced the college football playoff 4-team format, Ohio State as your national champions.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm such a broken record at this point about this team. I'm so bullish on Ohio State this year. I think it's very important for Ryan Day specifically that they have the kind of year we expect them to. I'm not saying you have to win the national title, but like you've got to win the Big Ten. You got to beat Michigan. Like you've got to erase the bad memories and the feeling that you've fallen behind the way that it's kind of felt the last couple seasons, because I mean, they had the best offseason in America, like you said. And I think, we've been referencing these returning production rankings all episode. And I think Ohio State's a good example of why, especially now in the transfer portal era, those are not, the end all be all by any means, because Ohio State ranks in the bottom half of returning production. I think that is very misleading, because I think you'd be hard pressed to find a position where they did not upgrade this offseason. Now, would they like to have Marvin Harrison Jr. on this team? Sure, absolutely. But I think, like you said, the guys you mentioned, I think, Emeka Egbuka, a very good receiver. I think Carnell Tate is a guy that I think really could be poised to step up, with the vacuum there at the top. And then Jeremiah Smith, he's as good as he's looked, in the small bits we've seen him so far. That's going to be dangerous right away. So,
and then that's not even in the country.
Yeah, I mean, like he could be that good. I mean, he could be one of the best receivers in the country this year. That wouldn't shock me. But I mean, yeah, and then when you pair that with the guy in Will Howard, who I think I agree is a clear upgrade over Colin McCord, just in all aspects. I mean, maybe not the best quarterback in the country, maybe not a guy that's going to win you the Heisman, but I think can do pretty much everything better than what they could last year. And then again, when you add in, like you said, guys like Quinshon Judkins at running back position with Travion Henderson, guys like Caleb Downs to a defense that's already loaded with talent, like this team has no clear weaknesses. I think, they're, to me, far and away the most talented roster in the Big Ten. They're my favorite to win the Big Ten. They're my favorite to win the national title. So that's where I'm at with this Ohio State team.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. And they're, if you look at their schedule, they start off with probably one of the weakest schedules when you talk about Akron, Western Michigan, Marshall. Then they kind of get into the teeth of it. They're going to play the Penn State. They're going to play Michigan like they always do. I'm going to be really interested to watch this game October 12th. I think that's Red River Rivalry Week. But that game, Ohio State at Oregon. That is going to.
What other newcomers do they play?
Just looking at the schedule, it looks like, is Oregon the only one they play? Yeah, Oregon's the only newcomer they play.
Gotcha.
Because they got Iowa.
Man, no Chip Kelly Bowl, huh?
Nebraska, Purdue, no Washington, but I, for me, if it's not the Michigan, if it's not the game at the end of the year, Michigan, Ohio State, the game to watch for me on this schedule is going to be that game against Oregon. Get your popcorn ready, because that is going to be a thrilling show. And before we get into our discussion over how we differ on our rankings. Based on these rankings, Texas would play Liberty. Oregon would play Missouri. Notre Dame would play Alabama, and Ole Miss would play Clemson. Of those games, Notre Dame, Alabama might be the most intriguing for me when I break it down that way.
Yeah, no, that'd be a good one for sure.
Okay, so let's break it down how we differed. 1, 2, 3, we were the same. We absolutely both went Ohio State, Georgia, Utah. We also both had Liberty in that 12 spot. For the most part, we agreed on almost everything except for the big difference. I think I had Clemson, and I had them in the number 4 spot taking the ACC. I did not have Penn State.
I had Penn State
mostly.
Yeah, I had Penn State sneaking into the field as the last at large from the Power 4 at number 11. Which, I mean, to be honest with you, like I've talked about it before. I have a lot of questions about this Penn State team, but I think there's enough talent. And, they got to play Ohio State. That sucks. That is tough for them. But I think there's enough talent on this roster that if Drew Aller can take like any sort of step forward, I think that they could be in that mix. But I mean, again, was skeptical. I mean, I had them as the last team in as far as at-larges go. But otherwise, we, for the most part, maybe a spot or two were off. But I think we kind of generally agree about what this at-large situation is looking like coming into the season.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, the only one we disagreed was Clemson versus Penn State, which understandable. I mean, I think we both have reservations about both teams when you really look at them. 7 out of the 12, we agreed on their exact placement. And then we agreed on 11 out of 12 overall, which Missouri, Alabama, Ole Miss, Florida State, we differed. But I think overall, I think we're on the same page when it comes to what we expect. Just real quick, based on where they are in the rankings, which team do you anticipate will be higher than where we had them in our initial rankings?
That's a good question. I think the safest bet is probably Missouri. I think having Missouri, I think there's a good chance this team ends up being higher than number 11, maybe pushing even more towards like the top 6 or 7. Wouldn't shock me.
I would go Missouri or Alabama, one of those two, I think, because we have Alabama 10.
Yeah.
So
which seems low. Like that seems like we're being negative about Alabama, but it's hard. Like when I look at these other teams, I think they have more questions than a lot of the teams we talked about today.
Yeah, there is very questionable spots. But I think overall, I mean, that's where we sit. We got Ohio State, Georgia, Utah, Texas, Florida State, Oregon, Notre Dame, Ole Miss, Clemson, Alabama, Missouri, and Liberty. All right, but that's going to do it for this edition of the College 12 Pack. Make sure you tune in next week. We'll have a new ranking to debate, and maybe it's head coaches as we dive into who are the best head coaches in college football heading into 2024. This will not be a career achievement. Where do they sit right now? We're going to power rank them for you on the College 12 Pack. For Tyler, I'm Patrick. We'll see you next week.